Hello everyone, and welcome to our third bite-sized learning module we are filming as part of our Modern Slavery Impact Initiative. These are a series of conversations we're having with leading experts throughout Australia, unpacking key modern slavery risk issues for Australian businesses. And this series has been made possible by the kind support of the Australian Government through the National Action Plan to Combat Modern Slavery. My name's Chris Caskey, and I lead the Human Rights Programming at the UN Global Compact Network in Australia. And it's my pleasure today to be joined by Rod Pickette, Policy Advisor at the Maritime Union of Australia, who is also the co-author of our latest publication, Maritime Shipping and Modern Slavery in Maritime Shipping. Rod's been working across maritime shipping and policy and human rights issues for the last 15 years or so we were very pleased to leverage his expertise in our latest guidance publication. Rod, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Chris.
Fantastic. And today, we're looking at modern slavery within maritime shipping. And I suppose, Rod, just to kick us off, it'd be really good if you could give us sort of just a bit of framing. So the shipping industry in general, how important is that to the Australian economy?
Well, shipping is a critical component of the Australian economy, Australia is the fifth largest user of shipping in the globe. So it gives you puts it in a little bit of perspective just how important shipping is to our island nation. The value of Australia's shipping exports in 2021-22, which was the latest year for which we have data, was in excess of $350 billion, and our imports in excess of $240 billion. So it's a very large component of the economy. Now that involved some 26,000 plus ship visits to Australian ports annually, involving more than 6,000 individual ships. Now on those ships would be a crew of international seafarers of somewhere between 24. So that gives you an estimation of the number of seafarers that are visiting Australia, in excess of 130,000. And they're in Australia on no less than 4 occasions. So we have a large interaction with international seafarers. And so that's where I think Australia has a particular obligation. The users of ships have a particular obligation to ensure that we are looking after the welfare and the rights of those international seafarers in that large chunk of international shipping that we interact with in Australia.
And I think some of those numbers are actually quite hard to fathom. You know, the fifth largest user of shipping in the world, and I think, did you say over 130,000 seafarers?
Yes, that's right.
So, what do we know about the modern slavery risks associated for those seafarers?
Well, the exploitation of international seafarers is sort of well known, certainly within the industry, perhaps not so well known in the wider Australian community, because ships tend to be out of sight, out of mind. Mm-hmm. People often forget that we're their daily products that they buy in the supermarket or in the retail sector, their electronic equipment for their house and all sorts of gadgetry that a large proportion of it arrives in Australia by ship. Mm-hmm. That exploitation reveals itself, particularly in the modern slavery context, essentially around the restriction of movement of seafarers. Now that has 2 components. One is the day-to-day restriction, which manifests itself in the lack of ability to have shore leave. Now, the ship is a moving platform out at sea for long periods of time, confined workspace, often in very difficult environmental conditions. And so the seafarer, really needs that access to shore time, not just for recreational purposes, to have a few hours, perhaps visit a city while they're in a port. They're in port for shorter and shorter times these days with high productivity port turnaround times, but for also medical appointments, and that can be for mental health, for counselling, to access Wi-Fi, to speak to their loved ones and their families, all that sort of thing. But more importantly, in the modern slavery context, is the inability of seafarers to be repatriated to their home nation at the end of their employment agreement. Now, every seafarer there must be, or should be, a signed seafarer employment agreement between the ship owner, represented by the master of the ship as the agent of the owner, and the seafarer themselves. So individual seafarer employment agreements, they themselves must reference the relevant collective bargaining agreement. That's usually an International Transport Workers Federation approved collective bargaining agreement, and there's several types of those. But the ILO Maritime Labour Convention specifies a maximum of 11 months at sea. That is the absolute maximum that a seafarer should be on board a ship without being repatriated at no cost to the seafarer to their home nation. Now, of course, in the COVID period, there were vast restrictions on that through government border restrictions and the actions of ship owners themselves and ship operators. And so the COVID period really shone a light on this issue of modern slavery risk or forced labour. But it's been out there for years. It's been happening for years. But there are other forms of exploitation that sort of flow from that. One is, for example, wage exploitation, where seafarers are not being paid, either not being paid in full or not being paid at all. And we had a 2022 report in Australia by the Australia Institute, which showed that somewhere between $40 and $80 million annually is being lost to international seafarers through exploitative wage practice. And that's just on seafarers visiting Australian ports. And that's just on the ships that were visited by the International Transport Workers Federation. So excessive overtime is another form of exploitation. It's a confined workspace. The workers don't go home at night. If there's work to be done, the master can require that work to be done. There's usually a cap on overtime, paid overtime. So seafarers are often doing unpaid overtime. And really the power imbalance, the employee relationship is such that what are you going to do? You can't avoid the workplace, so it's invariably done, but usually without pay. So there are and of course poor working conditions, access to healthy and nutritious food, for example. Often ships, when they're aging, they suffer from vibration and noise, affects people's sleep, fatigue sets in. There are all those sorts of issues that we don't often think about for us who are lucky enough to be able to return home at the end of each day and have a break from our work environment. Different for seafaring. So there's some of the ways in which exploitation occurs and brings us into that realm of modern slavery risk, forced labour in particular.
One of the things that really struck me throughout putting this publication together was looking at the ILO risk criteria for forced labour, and actually many of them are inherent to seafaring, just purely by nature of the profession, with isolation, potential for excessive overtime, poor working conditions. But one I thought was particularly interesting was the uncertain regulatory environment.
Yeah.
So my first thought hearing, you speak through some of those examples is, but what is the regulatory framework and who's looking at this? So
yes. Could
you unpack a little bit of that in the Australian context?
Yes, well, globally, international shipping is definitely under-regulated. And the difficulty it faces is that ships are meant to be regulated by the nation in which the ship is registered, not where the ship operates from. It may never go near the port of a ship of the country in which it's registered, countries like Panama and so on. So it then relies on what we call the port state regulators, those maritime safety authorities like the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, which has a port state control function. It has, under international arrangements, it has a responsibility to monitor the Maritime Labour Convention, which is given effect in Australian law by regulations made under the Navigation Act, which is administered by MSII, the Maritime Safety Authority. But MSII can only do it does its inspections on a risk basis. So it's not visiting every ship. Of course, those 6,000 ships visiting Australian ports on average 4 times a year, 130,000 ship visits a year. AMSA can't get to all those ships. So there's a lot is missed.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of the regulatory equation is the International Transport Workers Federation itself. Now in Australia, and like it has throughout the world, a team of globally around 160, I think, inspectors. In Australia, 4 or 5. But that's to deal with all the ports in Australia. And you think of all the bulk commodity ports, from the bauxite ports in Weipa, right round the coast through to the iron ore ports, the coal ports down the east coast, round to the iron ore ports in the west coast of Australia, and then all the container ports, and then the smaller ports doing specialist grain trade, wood products and so on. The ITF nor AMSA can get to those full range of ports all the time and inspect every ship. So this is where the guidelines that the Global Compact has produced is so important, because it puts a focus back on the cargo owner, and to start to really deal effectively with those exploitative practices, and so that those seafarers can enjoy their human rights.
And it was certainly, in engaging with the team of the International Transport Workers Federation in Australia, they are such a hard-working, small unit that do such important work. Looking at that regulatory framework and just kind of unpacking some of those different actors in there, are there any? I mean, granted, they can only see a small subset of the ships that are entering Australian ports, and that there may be risks on. But have there been any examples where they've identified issues?
Well, a recent example that AMSA, a part of its routine inspection process, found it was in November 2022. AMSA inspected a ship called the Costanza. It was a Liberian, a Panamanian flagged vessel transporting coal from Australia to Japan. On inspection, they found that the seafarers had been underpaid, and they only looked at a period of time, I think several months, sort of August or September till November, I think it was 2022. They found that they'd been underpaid to the tune of in excess of $66,000, and that's just a crew of 22 odd workers, seafarers, over a several month period. So it just shows you what is going on out there. Now, in that case that I mentioned, AMSA detained the ship, was able to ensure that those seafarers were paid their outstanding entitlements, and then the ship was banned from Australian ports for a period of 90 days, 3 months. So that was a big penalty to the ship owner, and a big penalty to the cargo owner who had been using that ship to transport their coal from Australia. So it just goes to show that, the risk when you're caught, it's severe. But we want to work together with all players across the spectrum, particularly the cargo owners, because under the UN guidelines, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and you might have been going to ask me some questions about this, but
yes, no, I was just going to say, well, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights is something that we work with companies on quite a bit, and they've been the authoritative international standard on integrating respect for human rights for business since they were unanimously adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2011, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And in particular, setting up that protect, respect, remedy framework. Now, and that's why I wanted to speak about cargo owners, because the cargo owner, as a business within that business relationship, has a responsibility to respect human rights.
Yeah.
That is not just upstream in their supply chain; it's also downstream. But it means they need to conduct, human rights due diligence, which means they are identifying, assessing, managing, and mitigating human rights risks where it occurs in all areas of their value chain. And that's why I think this publication is so important, is because we're actually saying, well, if you are a cargo owner, you may not be, if it's putting the ship owners just aside for a second, thinking of cargo owners, they may not be directly contributing to a potentially adverse human rights impact.
Yes.
But they may be directly linked to it as part of their business relationships. And that still introduces a responsibility to use your leverage to exert pressure where you have it. And that's one of the things, and that sort of goes to this grievance point, that we're looking to see with Australian businesses. You go, actually, if you are working in this space, if you are a particular industry, you do have leverage, that there's a responsibility to be using that. One of the things that we wanted to focus on in this publication in particular was the notion of the grievance mechanism, and in particular the collective grievance mechanisms that's contemplated in the UNGPs. Looking at the different actors in this space, we've obviously got the union bodies, we've got the businesses, the cargo owners, the ship owners, we've also got the government agencies. What do you think, what do you think would be the best way to sort of set up a grievance mechanism between those actors?
Yes, well, the Maritime Labour Convention actually requires every ship to have a grievance mechanism in place. So there's and that is set out in the Marine Orders under the Navigation Act. So Australian businesses have a statutory obligation to ensure there is a grievance mechanism. Unfortunately, those grievance mechanisms at the moment are very minimalistic, let's say, to put it mildly, and not particularly effective. And they typically take too long to be put in place. They're not structured in a way which is fair to the seafarer and is focused on remedy. So I guess the next step beyond the due diligence, and we've seen in modern slavery statements over the first 3 years of the operation of the Modern Slavery Act, some improvement in the way companies are reporting their processes, their due diligence process, and that's a great thing, and we welcome that. Where we think we want to be seeing real movement now is on the quality of those grievance mechanisms and addressing remedy. So we're actually getting some outcomes. Process is good, but process is just not an end in itself. It's surely leading to a remedy and an outcome. And then we'd like to see that reported, so that we'd like to be able to see not only there is a robust process delivering outcomes, but we'd like to see how that's being reported. How many seafarers used the remedial process? How many outcomes? What were the nature of those outcomes? Some aggregate. We don't need detail of every process, but we need some aggregate statistics. I think that would be the next phase of modern slavery statements, should start to see those. And I think the guidelines are such an important practical guide to assist the parties, the businesses who use shipping in their supply chains to start to address these issues. And we'll be looking out for those in future modern slavery statements.
And it's certainly something we wanted to focus on as part of pulling out those effectiveness criteria from the UN Guiding Principles and showing how, in the maritime context, this is how you can stand up each of those criteria items.
Yes, and I mean, look, it has significant productivity and continuity and good business practice sitting behind it. I mean, if you've got a good grievance mechanism that's working effectively, that is preemptive, deals with problems when they arise, then it's going to be far better for your business. It's going to be more productive, more profitable, less grievances, less sort of labour conflict to deal with, and that is good for both seafarers and business. So we're certainly expecting better outcomes and be able to preserve those through what we see in modern slavery statements in the future.
Fantastic. We could obviously talk about this all day, but that's all we have time for in this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to read our latest publication, Modern Slavery Within Maritime Shipping, you can view that in the link in the description below. And if you'd like to know more about the UN Global Compact, you can visit us at unglobalcompact.org.au. Thank you again, Rod, so much for your time today and for all your help with the publication. And I do need to do a shout out to the fantastic team of the International Transport Workers Federation for facilitating a lot of the access that sat behind our research. So thank you again, guys, for all of your work and your assistance with our publication as well. That's all for today.
Thank you, Chris. Been a great pleasure to work with the organisation, with Global Compact Network Australia, and we look forward to seeing a positive outcome for all this.
Fantastic. All right, well, thank you, Rod. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.